Yo, we hitting hyperspeed across the finish line. Lights on the ship look like it's Christmas time. Real recognize real, homie. And you've been looking unidentified. The government lied. Why is it classified if there's nothing to hide? That's why we're looking for answers up in the sky. It's The Theory with Mike Beaver.
Alright everybody, welcome to another episode of The Theory. Today we have a very special guest on the show, Paul Eno. Paul is actually celebrating over 50 years of paranormal investigations from all things demons, spirits, ghosts, poltergeist, UFOs, you name it, he's probably researched it and might have had an encounter or two. But we're going to talk to him about a lot of his work, working with Ed and Lorraine Warren, some of the first ever paranormal investigators who actually the Conjuring movies are based off of, and a bunch of other cool stuff. So stay tuned. As always, today's episode is brought to you by CreepyTiki.com and the Graveyard Goons. So let's go ahead and get into this. Today we have a very special guest, Paul Eno. He has an extensive resume, over 50 years of paranormal investigation and work, author of many titles of different books, radio host and personality. Paul, how you doing today, man?
Oh, better than nothing, Michael.
Awesome. Well, I've got a fun list of questions for you. I'm going to go ahead and start kind of early. I kind of want to know what got you into the paranormal so early, because I looked back at some of your biography stuff, and you've been doing this since around the 70s. Is that correct?
Yeah, about 1970. Yeah.
1970. So that's a long time. That was back when there was still a heavy stigma on this kind of stuff, and people would call you crazy if you saw a UFO or said you had a ghost in your house. What back then drove you to get into all this stuff?
Well, it was a very difficult situation 9 years before that, really. So 1961, we're going back to.
Oh, wow.
And as you can imagine, it was very difficult for me to discuss this at any point, let alone write about it. But at the age of 7, I was witness to my father's suicide.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and needless to say, a life-changing experience, to put it mildly. And I was in, my parents had a mixed marriage. My father was a garden variety Protestant. My mother was a Roman Catholic. My brother was about to be ordained to the priesthood. He was in 1963. And I was in a very strict Roman Catholic school. So if you said a bad word, or you ate a hot dog on Friday, or committed suicide, you went straight to hell.
Yeah.
Supposedly, right? And Sisters of Alleged Mercy were the teachers. Well, fortunately, and my second grade teacher was Sister Mary Joel. Now, the sisters were either saints or potential axe murderers, in my opinion. And Sister Joel was one of the saints, fortunately. And I said, Sister, I mean, what am I going to do here? Where's my father? And she essentially said, in so many words, God is bigger than all that. That really, really helped me get through. So fast forward to 1967, I was 14 years old. And I entered the seminary at that tender age, back when you could still do that. Not a good idea from an emotional standpoint, but I did it. So I was involved in the usual studies. It was high school level. You went to mass every day. You had a spiritual father, and you were kind of gradually developing to see if you had a vocation to the priesthood. Well, in 1970. I was still wondering, where is my father? Maybe, and the light bulb went on. So I thought this idea of purgatory, that the old Catholic idea that if you're not quite bad enough to go to hell, not quite good enough to go to heaven, you go to purgatory to be purged, hence the name, and then you can go to heaven, right? And also to satisfy the Western mania for pigeonholing everything. So so I kind of went around to different priests, my brother for one, and also one or two people who are well-known as theologians. And they said, well, what are you interested in that for? And nobody really cared. So in 1970, I heard about a case in Northeast Connecticut. I was from Connecticut. And there was an old man who had gone around since the 1940s and taken pictures in this abandoned settlement and got all kinds of weird stuff on the pictures. Weird streaks and blobs and all this sort of thing. So I said, this is interesting. So I contacted the guy. And I did a lot of research, all kinds of stuff to look up, and the history, et cetera. And in 1971, I went with several other seminary students to meet this man. He took us on a tour of what was known locally as the Lost Village, or the Village of Voices. And we found out immediately why it was called that. We walked in, and you could hear the sounds of daily life as if it was somebody else. You'd hear cows, dogs, metal implements banging together, people talking. And this is the middle of nowhere in Northeast Connecticut.
Nothing's out there.
Not that we could see. Well, not yet that we could see, right?
Okay.
Hot August weekend. And among the many things that happened, I've written this in several books. Among the many things that happened were we were standing on a ridge above Nightingale Brook, where these people had a mill in the 1700s and early 1800s. And all of a sudden we heard the laughter of children. But it was, and this is where I was first introduced to these spatial differences that can occur between worlds when you're in a paranormal situation. That's a long story, but these children, it seemed as though they were moving up and down this brook in a ridiculously rapid manner, as if they were in a car driving at about 60 miles an hour, because there wasn't even a road around. They were in a car, in the middle of the woods, and we all heard this. Now, the technology of the time was the cassette tape recorders and Instamatic 126 Kodak cameras, which were considered high tech. You didn't have to wind the film; you just threw the cartridge in there. These sounds would not pick up on the recording, so kind of an electromagnetic voice phenomenon in reverse. Today people get all excited when they hear the sounds on the tape, which may or may not be anything. But this was, we heard it with our ears, but didn't record. So that was really how I began, with the notion that maybe these are souls in purgatory.
Okay.
But from the first minute we arrived there, they didn't seem to be dead at all, never mind in purgatory. So my confusion in the 1970s really began with this case. I mean, there had to be more to this. And a few cases later, I was really convinced of the old ideas about dead people. It just wasn't good enough for what I was seeing. And then by the end of the 70s, I was running into the UFOs. So that's how I got started.
That's a little more on track of what I kind of do. I do a lot of sky watching out here. I've got some equipment I set up to try to record some stuff in the skies, but I have some questions for you about later. But I want to ask, I read that you had a lot of mentors, and Ed and Lorraine Warren were actually one of your mentors, as well as one of the technicians on the original Exorcist film. That's correct?
Yes, actually, the technical advisor for The Exorcist was Father John Nicola, a Jesuit priest. And my brother, when he became a priest, he ended up a professor at the seminary in Washington, D.C. at Catholic University, and the chair of the Department of Church History. So he knew Father Nicola, who was across the street at the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception. If you're watching the news at night, they have a scene of Washington in the background. There's the Capitol, and just off to the left, you'll see this big spire and a big dome. That's the National Shrine, okay? And Father Nicola had the anonymous job of being assistant director of this big attraction, this basilica. But what he was really doing was keeping tabs on exorcism cases in the United States for the Catholic Church. And so my brother introduced me to him, and that was, he became a mentor. And I went down to Washington a lot to see my brother, and I'd always be closeted with Father Nicola. And we corresponded all the time, and it was quite interesting. And it's funny, he said that he's sorry he ever did the Exorcist movie, in the sense of being the advisor for it. And he said a lot of the stories about things happening on the set, weird things happening on the set, were true. He saw some of them himself. So
go ahead. I apologize.
No, it's all right.
So I have a fun fact for you. I actually grew up in the Maryland and DC area. Silver Spring is where I really grew up, but we spent a lot of time in DC. And my Uncle Kenny, my grandfather's brother, was a big distributor for the Washington Post. And he actually got paid to do a drive-by on the big set of steps where I believe the guy falls down, and that big set of steps, he got paid to drive past it in his Washington Post van. And to this day, he still has the paycheck from them hanging up on the wall in his house. I thought that was interesting. What I seen that you worked with him.
Yeah,
very small world.
Yeah. But as far as the Warrens, I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead. No, that's exactly what I was going to go to. I was actually going to ask you with the Warrens, what was your relationship with them?
Well, in 1972, I wrote an article about the case I just described, the Village of Voices, describing my idea that these could have been souls in purgatory, which I now doubted. But Lorraine Warren got hold of that, and she thought that was a fabulous idea because they were supposed to be Roman Catholic, sort of a pop theology that they would follow. And she got in touch with me and invited me down to dinner. And one of the best cooks I ever knew, you never turn down a meal cooked by Lorraine Warren, right? So down I go to their house. They lived in Connecticut too, maybe about 60 miles from where I was. So down I went. And that's when I first met. 1972 was Ed and Lorraine Warren. They had just come off the case that the Conjuring was based on in Rhode Island, which is ironic, where I live today, about 8 miles from that house. And things come around. And that's how I got involved with them. And the real clincher on that was 2 years later, because I was in the seminary at the time. I would have been involved in the Amityville case, except that I was in the seminary at the other end of New York State, so I was out of reach.
Weren't able to be a part of it.
During that case. And then, of course, in 1974 was the Bridgeport Poltergeist affair in Connecticut, and which I was working with them on, totally unplanned. But that was that's quite well known now. It's going to be
that's like one of the bigger paranormal events. I was actually going to ask you. I've heard of the Bridgeport Poltergeist outbreak, but I'm not actually super familiar with it. So I was actually going to ask you, what was that kind of about? Were there just immense amounts of people reporting poltergeist activity, and what was kind of the stuff going on at the time?
Well, actually, it was kind of the opposite. What was special about it was the number of witnesses and the quality of the witnesses. Police officers, journalists, trained observers, engineers, this sort of thing. This is November 24th, 1974. I was home from the seminary for Thanksgiving vacation, and I'd gone down to have dinner with Ed and Lorraine. And as soon as I never got my dinner, because as soon as I got there, Lorraine came flying out the door and said, "Are you in a high spiritual state right now?" And I was actually in a terrible spiritual state because I was trying to decide whether to leave the Roman Catholic Church and join the Orthodox Church and go to their seminary.
Oh, wow.
So naturally I said, "Hey, no, I'm just ducky. Let's go, So I jumped in the car with Ed and went down, and Lorraine waited for Father Bill Charbonneau, the priest in the case, and he followed us down. And we found a very small house. And people see this house today and say, how could all this have happened in this little tiny house? It was really kind of a 3-room bungalow. And the people who lived there were a couple in their 40s and an adopted child from the Iroquois Nation named Marcy. And I walked in there, and there were already police officers who had been there for several hours before. And this had been building up for the better part of a year. They were knocking on the walls, this sort of thing. These things always start slowly.
Yeah.
And in my opinion, as you get more freaked out, you put out more energy, and they feed on it, and it gets stronger. So there was Mrs. Gooden arrived just after we did, because a television set had fallen and broken her toe. Flying across the room. She'd been to the emergency room and came back with her toe all bandaged up. And she grabbed my arm and said, "Have you ever seen anything like this before?" I said, "No, not really, no." Yeah. And Mr. Gooden was in the kitchen. The Gooden family, and his hand, his head was in his hand, and there was a huge, linebacker sort of police officer down in the cellar with Marcy, and they were already wondering if she wasn't doing some of this stuff. Because the police reports, which are public record, although they've disappeared, I have them, is that you had police officers writing official reports on seeing things flying off the wall. I stood there that afternoon with police officers and firefighters, watched a 300-pound refrigerator float off the floor in the kitchen.
What?
And there's something going on all the time. Furniture flipping over. Police officers described how Marcy was in one of these gigantic leather armchairs. She was in it. It slid across the room, and they could barely move it, the two of them. One officer was so freaked out, he backed out of the house, backed down the sidewalk, sat in his police car, wouldn't come out. So I
couldn't even imagine.
It was totally crazy. So we were there for the better part of 3 days, waiting for the Bishop of Bridgeport, the Catholic bishop, to give permission for Father Charbonneau to do an exorcism of the house. That permission never came. Ed Warren And it's ironic, when they threw me out of the seminary in 77, I ended up a journalist. Ed Warren, the first thing he would do is call the journalists in half the time, and so there were reporters coming in and out. The last thing I would do would be to call a reporter in this situation. It's not what I'm there for, right? But in any case, it was a 3-ring circus for the better part of 3 days. And probably the scariest thing that happened to me, on top of all this other stuff, I was injured by a flying TV set on Sunday night. On Monday late afternoon, and because this is November, so it got dark early. It was dark like 4:30, 5 o'clock. And the Warrens had gone to do some TV interview somewhere. And I was alone in the house with the family. And all of a sudden, the kitchen began to fill with this energy. You could see like it was almost cloudy in there. I had a prayer book that actually went down in urban folklore as something that it wasn't. It was an Orthodox prayer book with that funny Russian cross on the front. And it was Church Slavonic on one side and English on the other. So some journalist or police officer saw that and said, aha, this is written in Sanskrit and the kid's interested in the occult. It's not what it was. It was a prayer book owned by me. Anyway, I was reciting a prayer there just to kind of calm everybody down. 4 entities. And from the minute I stepped in that house, I felt that there were 4 entities involved here. Why, I don't know. But 4 things came down the hallway from the girls' room and the kitchen. And you could almost see like these gauzy structures. One of them came and stood right in front of me. I knew it was after the girl. I put her behind me. And this is where I learned the hard way that you do not become annoyed, fearful, or angry in the face of these things, because they feed on them. They are parasites. The folklore calls them demons, and that's what we were calling them, and that's how we approached it. But I was beginning to realize that there's a lot more to these realities than are the terms that we put on things, And this thing, I pushed against it just out of instinct. It pushed back. It had a physical body. And the tough things, Michael, are not necessarily the scary nature of the phenomena. It's the phenomena that smash your belief system. Because all we have is our belief system. Now, I was still in the seminary studying theology, and this is supposed to be a demon, which is by nature a spirit. Well, this was no spirit. I was completely flummoxed. This thing got around me, threw the girl across the room. And at that point, it felt like the place was going to explode. I pulled everybody out of the house, down onto the front sidewalk. Fortunately, the police had blocked off both ends of the street because there had been 2,000 to 3,000 people outside this house at any one time. And so we didn't walk out in the middle of a crowd. I went next door to call the Warrens, these days before cell phones or any of that. And I called them. It took them an hour to get back into the city from 10 miles away because of all the traffic. So that was the sort of the highlight, if you can call it that, of my experience. And then the next day we were thrown off the case because the cops came in and said the city's tied up in knots. We got to clear this up. The kid did it. And they waited until the 3 of us had left temporarily. And then I heard it on the New York radio station on the way back to East Hartford, where I lived. I was going to take a shower and stuff. But it sort of descended into chaos. And then a group from Duke University came up later, and it really didn't come to much, but we heard all kinds of things about Marcy being taken to the state hospital and things following her there. And it's a long story. I recommend William J. Hall's book, The World's Most Haunted House, because he got it all together, and he got together all the 80-year-old retired cops. It was a few years ago, and he got to me, and he put the whole thing together and did a good job. So
that was amazing. That sounds scarier than any horror movie I've ever watched, to be 100% honest. And it all
was worse than that. A few years later, in '79, probably the closest I ever saw to Hollywood. But the Warrens weren't involved. I had broken up with them by this time, and I did not call the press, so this was not all over the. It's not being made into a movie, but it was worse than the Bridgeport case.
That's absolutely wild. And it sounds like even though it was way back when, there was still a lot of attention to it. I imagine back in the day when I hear about old paranormal stories and stuff, I don't really imagine there being a whole lot of press or anybody really so much paying attention to it other than the person who's directly experiencing it. But that sounds like a lot of people were really wondering what was going on there, and all the stuff you described, I could not imagine. I had one paranormal experience in a town called Jaredstown, West Virginia, and we actually, believe it or not, we lived on church property. It was the pastor's house that the church rented out, I guess maybe for funds, and we lived in that house for about 6 months. And one day, my whole family was actually gone, and I was at home. I wasn't feeling good, had a headache and stuff, and I was laying on the couch, and I heard what sounded like music, maybe from a TV, and the cracking of the floor, where normally, like in the attic area where my mom's bedroom was, you would hear if she was walking back and forth. And in my head, for some reason, I was like, did my mom not leave? And I walked upstairs and there was nothing. The lights were off. There was nothing up there. And I actually ran outside and sat in the driveway until my mom got home because I was so scared. But other than that, I've never had a full-on paranormal experience, but I've seen some of these videos of supposed poltergeist activity, and hearing some of your encounters. It really makes me wonder what it would be like to have to go through all that stuff.
Yeah, well, it's not something you would want to wish for usually.
Yeah.
But I think that we live in a multiverse, I believe, and this is, by the end of the 70s, I couldn't understand what I was dealing with here until I ran into quantum mechanics and the multiple worlds interpretation thereof, and that really seemed to fit, because I was running into people who were seeing ghosts of themselves, ghosts of people who hadn't died yet, ghosts, if you will, of buildings or even whole towns that weren't there the next day, that sort of thing. In 74, I ran into that in Vermont with a couple of surveyors, as far as a house, and a very strange guy was there when they were walking some bounds in order to survey it. And when they went back the next time, the house apparently had burned down in 1910, sort of thing. So I said, there's a lot more going on here than dead people. I said,
it sounds like it.
Yeah, so that led into the multiverse ideas, which I think explain as much as anything can all paranormal phenomena as being. And Ben and I, my son Ben, who works with me since 2005, we had to invent an entirely new vocabulary just to talk about these concepts. Overwash, intersect point, identity point, flashing nexus, things of that kind that we hit, just to talk about these things. And we believe that, and that's why we started looking in 05 at what we refer to as flap areas. Areas where the one we were investigating in Connecticut that started in 05 was up to about 335 square miles at this point, going over to the Hudson Valley of New York. UFOs, cryptids, ghostly phenomena, things that don't even have names yet, time slips, and you wouldn't believe some of the stuff we've documented over there. Pennsylvania, Western Pennsylvania, same thing. Bridgewater Triangle in Massachusetts, which is only about 20 miles from where I live. I'm going to be there Tuesday and Wednesday, doing some filming there. And Rendlesham Forest in England, the same thing. People think of just the UFO landings of December 1980. There was a lot more going on there than that. Still is.
Yeah. So I actually did an interview with Jim Peniston from the Rendlesham Forest incident.
Oh, Jim, feet on the ground guy.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Definitely really interesting stuff. Now, when you talk about multiverse and these kind of things, so in a sense of that, do you believe that maybe some of these UFO cases, paranormal, spirits, ghosts, if you may, do you believe they are all connected in a sense of maybe they all are part of this big type of deal instead of just all separate?
Yes, I think so too. And it takes people a while to get their minds around that, because we're used to thinking of these things as separate and unrelated phenomena. But I think when you have the conditions that allow one to manifest, you're going to have the other. And I'll go a step further with that and say that, if UFOs, or some of them at least, are craft from other worlds, whether those be other planets or other times or whatever, the technology may exist by whoever is operating them to use these, what a physicist will actually call a membrane or brain, BRANA, between these worlds, in order to travel without really traveling across the membrane. And since you're using the principle that all possible outcomes exist somewhere or somewhen in the multiverse, and you can go where you want to go if you have the ability by using those principles, which is why we think we keep running into the military or something that looks like the military in every single flap area we investigate. Wouldn't we love to weaponize these paranormal principles? Wouldn't we love to capitalize on them for commercial uses? You know, and never underestimate the interest of industry and commerce in these things. So it's a whole new first day of school here, Michael, I think. And,
I'm learning something new talking to you for sure. I actually something kind of similar to this. A guy I've talked to, Jeff Woolwine, does a lot of research down in Arizona. He believes that natives actually carved out these petroglyphs that depicted the Phoenix Lights, and that these orbs and similar sightings that look like the Phoenix Lights were actually some sort of spiritual thing, maybe multidimensional, that we're seeing, and not actually these crafts from another planet themselves. And that's immediately what I kind of thought about when you're talking about multiverse and things like that. Almost, I'm trying to blend the spiritual side of things into the UFO side of things. But then in the same token, I think about things like, say, the Nimitz and the Pentagon videos that seem to show something a lot more, I would say, technological in a sense, if you would say, rather than an orb. And I try to mix them two together. And to me, that makes it feel like two different things. But the way you explain it with the multiverse thing, it does make more sense, because you could, it's a any possible outcome scenario. So that's a really interesting take on that. Have you yourself ever encountered any UFO activity or seen anything pretty wild up there in the sky?
Well, you might say that. Probably the two major encounters were when I saw the Phoenix Lights from an airplane.
Oh, wow.
I believe it was 06. Ben and I were on the way. We're taking the red eye, as they say, to San Diego to do a program there. And, those days on a plane, I don't know about today's, probably no better. You're lucky you're on the same plane with your son, never mind in the same seat. Somebody else is snoozing happily away, and I happened to look out. I knew it was Phoenix, and I could see this line of lights in the sky. Now, I did a lot of time in the reserve, in the military, but did a lot of active duty. So I knew I know a flare when I see one. This is not what this was. These things, one of them broke up and seemed to descend toward the ground, and the others were lined up. Now we got to because we're zipping by here, but we got to San Diego the next day, and in the paper it said they'd seen the Phoenix Lights the night before. So I don't know too many people seen them from an airplane, but a commercial aircraft. So
that's got to be. How close were you? Do you know?
It's
relatively.
At night it's difficult to say. I'd say within 5 miles anyway, maybe closer. Okay. And I'd say, ballpark, maybe they were about 10,000 feet off the ground, if that. And we're going by 33, of course, 32 or 33,000. So, and then probably much more dramatic than that was May 24th, 2016. And I happened to have my brand new Bestgarter 300 IR binoculars, which I'd never used before. And I got what Mark D'Antonio from MUFON calls one of the two best videos of UFOs he's ever seen.
Really?
And we had a number of witnesses. We were down there doing our annual checkup on the place. It's a major flap area. I had seen Bigfoot myself. So had one of our other people at that point. And we had been out there, just kind of at our posts, and we were asked to come back and stargaze. Shane Searway, if you haven't had him on your show, you should. One of our colleagues said, I just got the feeling we should stargaze that night. So we went down. The family had a lovely, where our base camp was, very, very hospitable people. They had a lovely patio outside, open to the sky. And we were just sitting there talking, a little campfire. All of a sudden, Shane and Alexander Petikoff, the filmmaker, said, look at that. And up in the sky was like a very bright kind of cloud-like substance, and a smaller circular object came out of that and went around, and underneath it you could see darker than dark coming out of the bottom of this cloud-like structure. And we watched this for about 3 minutes. It went across the sky. I got the whole thing on video, And you can see, people can see this video on the Facebook page of our radio show, Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno. And it's one of the videos there. And so that was quite the wake-up call there. And there was a sequel to that the next night. We had been at a little park that marks the passage of, everybody's sort of the Continental Divide, but there's an Eastern Continental Divide and a Western Continental Divide on top of that. And this is the Eastern Continental Divide goes right through this property. And we find that geotechnic and seismic factors have a lot to do with flap areas, as does the Bouget anomaly as well. That's a whole different subject. Okay. So we had been watching. There was about 1 o'clock in the morning. We came back. We went into the garage. We were saying goodnight. Chuck Credo of Seacoast Saucers of New England, one of our gang, had already kind of gone to bed, but he wasn't asleep in the apartment next to the garage. And all of a sudden we heard, and one of our producers from New York had arrived, and right over her head was this tone. And Ben described it, Ben, my son, who was back in Rhode Island getting ready for a 2-hour special we were going to do the next day, said it was a perfect C. It had all very strange characteristics. This tone moved from over our heads in the garage, went out through the closed door. We went out with it. It went up into the air, went to the right, faded away, powered up again, went to the left, and then went off into the sky. And 7 witnesses, but Chuck didn't hear it. And our hosts who were in the bedroom with windows open just above this garage didn't hear it either. But we all heard it, and we recorded it. So, and what I had done previously, the previous evening before we had the sighting that we got the video of, was to play. Shane played some tones from Mount Shasta, and I played some very lovely music from a very, very unusual Scandinavian American composer known as Mord Lauridsen, who writes some liturgical music and just some a cappella music in different languages. I just played that. And when I started to play that up in the upper field where I'd had my Bigfoot experience in 2016, all these lights started to flash around the truck. And so I wonder if this wasn't some sort of response. I mean, we've never really found out. So, I've had a few UFO experiences.
Yeah, it sounds like it. I got into UFOs. I think I had a UFO sighting. Let me put it that way. When I was younger with my brother, when we were about 9 and 10, we're only about a year apart. And it was of a cylindrical, almost solid white object with no light. And it was actually in Silver Spring, Maryland. And it went in between a couple of buildings. And it didn't have any noise or anything from what I remember. My grandfather actually saw it. But that's honestly not even what got me into the UFOs and stuff like that. That was kind of just an experience I always have had a memory of. But here in Springfield, Oregon, back in 2019, actually, I recorded what was it. People call it a triangle, but at first it was 3 perfect orbs that came in a flight path, like flat, directly across the sky, and they stopped, turned directly upwards, and that's where you seen them in the triangle formation, which is basically where I started recording, and then just turned off like a light switch, and we're completely gone. And when that happened, I actually I posted it on some local Facebook groups, and a guy named Tobe Johnson, who happens to be a pretty well-known Bigfoot researcher out here in Oregon, contacted me, and he wanted to come interview me within, he was at my house within an hour of me actually recording this and posting it on Facebook. And he was talking to me about it. He was like, UFO sightings can sometimes lead to other Bigfoot type activity and sightings. And so that was his main focus of why he wanted to interview me for it. But he interviewed me for his podcast. And that's when I was like, you know what, that's what I want to do. This was so interesting. I saw that he put boots on the ground and would go out here and talk to people and stuff like that had these experiences. And so I invested in some astro cams. I have a little setup specifically for nighttime sky watching, telescopes, cameras, and all that kind of stuff. And while I don't see activity all the time, something very similar to what you described is probably the most common thing that I do end up seeing. And it looks like a ball of light, and it kind of comes across the sky and will fade out into nothing. Sometimes it'll light back up. But most of the time I've ever seen them, which is probably on 6 or 7 different occasions, it'll come, it'll get really bright for a second, and then it'll dim out to nothing, and you won't see it anymore. So that's actually really interesting that you kind of describe something like that, because that's the I would say the typical thing that I've ever seen. So I thought that was really, really interesting. What do you think about, what are your future, I would say, predictions in the world of ufology, paranormal research? I know a lot of people are talking about disclosure and stuff like that. What are your predictions on seeing where some of this kind of goes? Do you think research is going to get way heavier and people are really going to pay attention, or do you think people will just forget about it?
Well, I don't think this can be forgotten very easily. We're all waiting for, was it the 25th, and the Pentagon is supposed to release all this stuff. Well, Ben and I are on a lot of, we're not usually asked to speak at paranormal conferences as such, because we're not good for business. I mean, we question all their theories about dead people. Okay. We speak at a lot of UFO conferences, though, and there'll be panels afterwards with all the speakers, and the headliners will be next to us. So all of whom we love very much. They're all good friends, and they'll speak learnedly about, oh, it's going to be next year. They're going to let us know, and then they'll tell us what they. And they get to me, and I'll say, okay, show of hands, who here believes what the government says? Everybody groans, And I said, I think disclosure is going to, and I rubbed elbows with the intelligence community when I was in the service. My clearance wasn't very high, and we didn't deal with this stuff, but I know how it works. And they're going to release accurate information from inaccurate sources, and vice versa. And if you think they're going to tell you the whole story, there may be bits of truth in it. There may not be. They probably don't know a lot more than we do. But I just don't think it's going to be worth much. And supposedly people have seen this report, and they say, well, just, we don't really know. And they probably don't. I just, obviously they have to watch it, but I don't have a lot of confidence there's going to be a lot of disclosure. I'll tell you, Michael, I think we are the disclosure.
The people. I like it. That's kind of my take on it, is what I was thinking. They were going to let out a couple tips. But really, I feel like, in a sense, disclosure's already happened as far as the mainstream goes. Most people that I've talked to, friends, I play a lot of Xbox and stuff like that. I do little gaming streamings here and there. And most of the people I talk to, my gamer tag is actually the title of my YouTube channel, which is UFOs over UFO. And most of the people, as soon as they see it, the first thing they go, they're like, oh, man, we got this alien guy in the game with us. And I ask them, you believe in UFOs? You ever seen one? And I would say at least 80% of the random people I've never met in my life that I ask if they have seen a UFO, they all say, yes, this one time I saw this one time I saw this. And it trips me out, because maybe 20 years ago, say maybe back in the earlier days, if you ask people, they said, seen a UFO, they'd be like, what are you, crazy? I don't know what you're talking about. So I feel like disclosure, in a sense, is already happening over a slow period of time through the people and not the actual government, because now people are paying attention. Fox News is always, covering the UFO stories about the government and stuff like that. But people are watching. They want to know. Even my friends that aren't into UFOs and stuff like that, they're always asking me, hey, you heard anything new yet? When that report's come in. And so I feel like you're 100% right on that. Now, what about the future of paranormal research? Do you see anything new coming, new maybe technology or science that could help determine, and put on paper what some of this activity is maybe caused by, in a sense? I don't, that's a hard question to ask, but maybe in a sense of new tech or something that might be able to pick up some of this stuff better for us.
That's a tough question, Michael. We have, as part of our informal gang, a behavioral scientist who's really trying to get us into more data gathering and that sort of thing. And that's fine. But one of my other mentors was Louisa Rhine, Dr. Louisa Rhine from Duke University. She and her husband, Joseph B. Rhine, were really the founders of modern parapsychology. And they were always trying, in my opinion, to make a square peg fit a round hole. I think we may be dealing with stuff that is outside of science. As a matter of fact, I would go so far as to say that today's paranormal is tomorrow's science. All right. And as far as, it's undiscovered science, as my friend Mark D'Antonio might say. On the other hand, I think we have to start expanding the box, or thinking outside, as the cliche goes, because we put labels on things that we can understand. You see your great grandfather, skipping down the road 2 years after his funeral. You say, aha, a ghost, some kind of residue or whatever. Well, that's not necessarily true with this multiverse idea. If it's correct, it's probably the guy in a world where he never died, and you're having an intersect experience. And I think that there may be whole new ways to think about this. My publisher for most of my books is Schiffer Books in Pennsylvania, and they had a roundtable they invited me to participate in, wondering why paranormal books weren't selling as they had been previously. And I said, look, I think people are sick of the same old 19th century ideas. I think they want something authentic and new, something that makes sense, and yet that will get you outside of the old ideas. And I said the whole thing has to be rebuilt from the ground up, the whole field. And I think that one of the ways to do that is to look at that from the multiverse standpoint. Now, on our show, we're always, not always, but very often, I think we give short shrift to a lot of the paranormal groups. I mean, you sit on a street corner and you throw pebbles, you're going to hit 10 people who are in paranormal groups, right? And but they write into us and say, don't be so fast to judge. We're using your theories and methods, and we're getting some amazing results. So we're trying to be a little more careful on how, if we sort of denigrate any of these folks. Many of them are very good. We don't recommend people do this, but I think in the future you may see a more serious approach. One of the problems is reality TV. We are always being approached by producers to consider doing a show, but when they hear our ideas, they say, well, we want our ghost. This was actually said to us by the top executive at one of the channels. I want my ghosts to be ghosts and my demons to be demons. So even if they aren't, even if those are just labels, I mean, there's a whole huge audience out there, people who have brains, high income even. So that interests the producers, and they want a new approach. So I would like to think that in the future there will be a more sensible, we call it progressive paranormal theories and approach. No political intention, overtones intended. But I think new ideas have to come to the fore and a new approach for us to get anywhere. That's
I like it.
I hope it's going.
I like that. That actually is probably a great answer to that question. It makes sense to me because when I think about paranormal shows, obviously one of the first ones that pop in my head is like Ghost Adventures with Zach Baggins, and I feel like you can only get so much information out of a voice recording of a strange noise that you're trying to depict out of. And I know people have used that sort of that method of investigating a lot when it comes to ghosts and spirits and hauntings. But I like your answer because that makes me think there is going to be a broader look at all of it rather than just that same old exact flat plane route of investigation. That gives me some hope. Now, do you have any future projects or any investigations coming up in the future or any big conventions going on?
Oh, well, of course, a lot of the conventions have been, because of COVID, have been scaled back. Unfortunately, probably our favorite event of the year was the Exeter UFO Festival in New Hampshire. And that the town canceled that this year. We were kind of surprised, but hopefully next year. So as far as that's concerned, I'm addressing the Philadelphia MUFON, the mainline MUFON in September. Is going to be about these connections we've been talking about, Michael, today.
Okay.
And good friend Jennifer Stein runs that group. And so there is some, I'm working on another book. We figure we speak at all these UFO conventions, we should at least write a UFO book. So we're writing Behind the Paranormal 3 Uneasy Skies, which is going to feature a lot of the people we've interviewed, including Stanton Friedman, who is a good friend of ours, and other people who have been on the show over the years. And that's going to be out next year. So that's we're kind of concentrating on that and on the Flatberry research, Bridgewater Triangle, and back to Pennsylvania in the fall.
Awesome. That sounds great. Speaking of festivals, have you ever made it out to the Oregon McMillanville Festival out here, the UFO Festival?
No, I've heard of it, but nobody's ever invited us.
Oh,
It's
I'm
a
gonna have
hint.
to go out there. I want to go out there and set up a table one day. I'm not exactly sure what it takes to I guess maybe speak at one of these or something. I might need a little bit more experience before I do, but I definitely plan on making it to the next one. And from what I can tell, I think they are still having one this year. I believe it's in the fall time, somewhere
Yeah.
around that. So I gotta look into it. But that's really cool, man. Those conventions and stuff. I imagine you hear a lot of information, talk to a lot of people with a lot of experience. Um, it sounds amazing. So before we finish up today, I want to ask you, you've given us a lot of great information, a lot of great stories. I now know that you probably should tell people you shouldn't try this at home when it comes to paranormal investigating from some of your experiences. It sounds pretty dangerous, but what if you could give anybody advice that's, you know, coming up? A lot of my audience is younger. Some of them are just kind of dabbling in this stuff because they think it's interesting or cool. What advice would you give them coming up in the paranormal, ufology, multiverse ideas? What kind of advice would you give them to keep into this kind of stuff?
I think the universal advice is what Ben and I call the Peter Pan theory. Keep it positive, think happy thoughts. It'd be amazingly, we used to go charging into these exorcism cases with crosses and holy water. Sometimes it would work, sometimes it wouldn't. But what always worked was when the family involved or the people involved pulled together, expressed their love for each other, and kept it positive in their home. That's the whole thing. Keep love, humor, faith, whatever's good and positive. That's your big defense. I don't recommend that people go out and look for this stuff. All too often it finds you, but it is what it is. Keep it positive.
I love it, man. I love it. Well, that's about it. I really appreciate you coming on the show. You've got some great information. I'm going to post all your links in the description of this video and podcast, and everybody go check him out, man. This guy's got some amazing information. So, Paul, I really appreciate you coming on.
Thank you, Michael. It's a great pleasure.